Hello everyone, welcome to yet another video in our series on our ongoing series on literary terms and devices. And as I'm sure you know, for the past couple of sessions, we have been dealing with the genre of poetry, and we have talked about all of those literary terms and devices which describe those fundamental parts of poetry, those fundamental units of poetry. And it was only natural for us to do so because in today's session we are going to talk about different poetic forms, like for example, sonnet, ode, I don't know, epic poetry, etc. And whenever I talk about a specific poetic form, I will tell you that this poetic form consists of such and such lines with a certain kind of meter, with a certain kind of rhyme scheme. And so we had to talk about all of those fundamental parts like meter, rhyme scheme, etc., stanzas, so that we would be ready for today when we talk about all of these poetic forms. And so, for example, when I tell you that this specific poetic form consists of iambic pentameter lines, and then the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, you know what I'm talking about. So in today's video, we are going to talk about poetic forms, some of the most common and popular poetic forms in English literature. However, before we do that, there are two more literary terms which we need to discuss, which are also associated with sound, the soundscape of a poem. So once we do that, we are ready to talk about those poetic forms I just talked to you about. So without further ado, let's start talking about those two remaining keywords which are about the soundscape of a poem. Well, the first one is onomatopoeia or onomatopoeia, which of course is also known as echoism in English literature. Now, echoism or onomatopoeia has two very distinct definitions. On the one hand, let me just tell you the Farsi equivalent of it first. We call this nomovo, which means that it is a word which traditionally doesn't have a meaning, and it is only used for the sound that it represents. So, for example, this is the basic definition of echoism, which I want you to know: the fact that the sound of a word represents the meaning of the word. Okay, so this is the first definition, as you can see here. It is a word or a combination of words whose sound seems to duplicate the sound it denotes. What does this mean? The meaning of the word is the sound of the word itself. That's it. So when we say, for example, haha, well, the meaning of haha is haha, laughter, a kind of laughter. When we say boom, something like that, so the meaning of the word boom is the sound of the boom that I just made with my mouth for you. So buzz, hiss, all of these sounds have an intricate relationship, have an intimate relationship with the meaning of the word, okay? So when there is this kind of intimacy or this kind of advanced correlation between the sound of a word and the meaning of a word, we call that onomatopoeia or echoism. However, as I'm sure you can guess, it needn't be an exact replication of the sound. So sometimes the sound and the meaning are a little bit different, but we can understand the correlation between them. As I'm sure you have guessed by now, I talked about the correlation between sound and meaning, right? And if you remember in our previous video, we also talked about the close relationship between sound and meaning when we were talking about euphony and cacophony, right? So that's basically it. That's the second definition of onomatopoeia. a correspondence between sound and sense. Now, the best example, let me first tell you what this means again. This means that a good piece of poetry should have two very important qualities. The soundscape of the poem should be as well crafted as the meaning behind the poem. So the writer should spend as much time as he or she does for the meaning for the sound too. Okay, so it is important for the poet to think about the sound of the lines as well as the meaning. And a lot of different critics and poets usually argue that the best kind of poetry is a kind in which the sound can help us understand the meaning, and the meaning is made clear to us by the sound of the lines. No one does this better, no one represents this better than these 4 lines by Alexander Pope. Let us read these lines. Now, just keep in mind that Alexander Pope has written these 4 lines about 2 mythological figures, Ajax and Camilla. And now let's see if we can find this definition of onomatopoeia in these 4 lines. When Ajax strives some rock's vast weight to throw, did you notice how difficult I was reading that? I was not putting up a show, no. I was actually reading it as well as I could, and as you can see, it is very difficult to read this. Let's try that again. When Ajax strives some rock's vast weight to throw. It is a very difficult line to read. Just practice it right now. Pause the video and try to read this line. It is very difficult to read this line, okay? Because the sound of Ajax strives, the S sound, and then some rocks vast. It is very difficult to pronounce. Now, is this a kind of a conscious choice of words on the part of Alexander Pope? Definitely. He has chosen these words carefully. He could have chosen so many other words with the same meaning. Like instead of strives, he could have written tries hard. When Ajax tries hard, that was easier to read. But then he has chosen these words deliberately because he wants you to feel the meaning of the line and the difficulty of Ajax, trying to throw a huge rock by forcing you to read a very heavy line. So the heaviness of the rock that Ajax, the mythological figure, is trying to throw is represented by the heaviness of the line that you want to read. This is correspondence between sound and sense. The line too labors and the words move slow. Now let's talk about Camilla, a very fast-moving figure. Not so when swift Camilla scours the plain. So Ajax was a mythological figure, a fighter, and now in this scenario, he's lifting a very big stone to throw. But Camilla was known for her, speed. Okay, so now when we read this, the sound helps us understand the swiftness and the speed of Camilla. Not so when Camilla scours the plain. As you can see, it is a very easy and it is a light line. Flies over the unbending corn and skims along the main. Easy lines, because Camilla is a fast-moving mythological figure, but Ajax is not, and so the line moves slowly, just like Ajax, who's holding a very big and heavy stone. So this is like the perfect example of the correlation between sound and sense, exemplified by the great Alexander Pope. Now, the second keyword we're going to talk about today, before we talk about all of those poetic forms, is of course alliteration. In Farsi, in Persian, we call it vajarai, right? So it's the repetition Alliteration is actually the repetition of a single speech sound in a sequence of nearby words. And it is used for special stylistic effects, of course. But what are those effects? Sometimes we use alliteration to reinforce meaning because it is important for us to help the reader understand a certain meaning in the line. And so we stress a special sound in the line so that by focusing on that sound, the reader or the listener can understand some deep meaning. Sometimes we use alliteration to link related words. And then, of course, these are some of the techniques that modern poets use. But in Old English, because the verse was unrhymed, and so they didn't have any other choice but to use alliterative meter to make their poetry more rhythmic, right? And so in Old English, we had a kind of meter which was called alliterative meter. How was this alliterative meter achieved in Old English? Well, the lines were usually divided into two half lines, okay? So think of it as, for example, a bait which has been divided into two mesras, right? A line was divided into two half lines. There was a pause between them, a caesura. There was a pause or a caesura in the middle of the line. And then there were two stressed syllables in the first half line, which kind of corresponded to two stressed syllables in the second half line. And there was a repetition of a sound in those stressed words. So let me just rephrase this. In Old English, they used a kind of meter which was called alliterative meter. Now, alliterative meter was used in this specific way. A line was usually divided into two half lines, and there was a pause in the middle. Now, in each half line, there were two stressed syllables, and all of these stressed syllables, the first two in the first half line and the second two in the second half line, had one common sound, and the repetition of that sound created alliteration. This is an example from Old English. In a summer season when soft was the sun. So again, two stressed syllables, and the common sound is s. When soft again was the sun. Soft and sun are again two stressed syllables, and they also have the repetition of the same sound, s. So in a summer season when soft was the sun, this is an example of alliterative meter. Now, okay, having discussed these two words, echoism and of course alliteration, we are now ready to begin our journey into poetic forms. But let us begin with a very simple practical definition of poetic form. What is a poetic form? A poetic form is a type of poem, right? Which has its own unique rules, and it is associated with particular themes in literature. Okay, so that's a very, very simple definition of a poetic form. So it is a special type of poem, like in Persian we call them qasideh, ghazal, masnavi, all of those. They have their own unique rules, and they're usually associated with certain themes and ideas. And then the first one which we are going to talk about is lyric. And the reason why I have chosen lyric as the first poetic form to discuss is because lyric is a versatile kind of poetic form which can be written in so many different other forms. So lyric poetry is not just about the format of the poem, it's more about the philosophy behind those lines. So think of lyric poetry as a kind of a special school of poetry, which can be written, which can be composed in, I don't know, in Masnavi format, which can be written in the sonnet format, ghazal, which can be written in the ode format, qasideh, which can be written in all different kinds of formats. Okay, so even though we call lyric a special kind of poetic form, I want you to think of it as a school of poetry rather than a form, because lyrics can be written in so many different shapes and forms, okay? What is lyrical poetry? Lyrical poetry is any kind of poem, and just focus on what a broad definition I'm offering right here. Any kind of poem which focuses on the individual. So it is very individualistic in nature. The voice which is present in the poem, the voice of the poet, which is not always the case. So we say the narrator or the persona. The persona in the poem is usually a person who's alone, if not lonely, because he's alone, he also feels lonely, and he's an introverted person. And this introverted person tries to portray his or her own world to the audiences, to everyone who's listening. This person has a unique emotional perspective towards the world, and this school of poetry is full of contemplation, a kind of, thinking deeply about the world and then trying to present your own unique version of the world to whoever is listening to you. This in turn leads to an outburst of emotions in this kind of poetry. So this is the definition of a lyric. Now, lyric poetry in Western culture has some, is as old as history itself, as English people say. So in the Western culture, the lyrical persona, the person who's talking in the poem, usually expresses his deep emotions, and he's usually expressing his emotions accompanied by a musical instrument which has mythological roots. And because for lyric poetry, music is extremely, extremely important. Now, the musical instrument that is usually associated, as the name, of course, the name lyrical poetry suggests, is lyre. And then lyre is a mythological musical instrument because, in Greek mythology, well, first we have Hermes, who, who's associated with music, of course, and with playing. And then once Apollo hears Hermes, and then because he's so enchanted by the sound of the lyre, he actually asks Zeus for the lyre, and then accordingly, he becomes the god of music and singing. So it has all of this mythological roots associated with it. As I said, lyrical poetry can be written in different shapes and forms, in sonnets, quatrains, masnavi, odes, all of these different forms. And the topics can be what I have listed here for you. It could be love, it could be mysticism, it could be nature, nostalgia for the past, the human condition, and of course, it could also include some kind of philosophical contemplation. We will talk about this when we, of course, talk about odes later on in this video. And in the West, it became popular in the Renaissance, of course, and later on was taken up by so many different poets in different centuries. So, for example, in the Renaissance, we have Petrarch, who uses it in the form of a sonnet. Of course, we have the Petrarchan Sonnet. We have Sir Thomas Wyatt, who introduced the Petrarchan Sonnet into English literature. And of course, we have William Shakespeare, who created the English sonnet. So all of these poets in the Renaissance used lyric poetry in the form of course, Petrarch was Italian. So in Italy, and Wyatt and Shakespeare in England used lyric poetry for in the form of a sonnet. In the 17th century, Robert Herrick, the Englishman, the English poet, favored lyrical poetry. When we go to the 18th century, which was, of course, the age of enlightenment, this particular school of poetry lost popularity, but then it was revived in the Romantic period, and some of the most important Romantic poets of all, including William Blake, Wordsworth, Shelley, and John Keats. We will talk about John Keats too, as well as Wordsworth in today's video. all of them use lyrical poetry. Of course, it was also popular in France, in Germany, in Russia. In France, Lamartine and Victor Hugo were the poets who used lyrical poetry. In Germany, we have Goethe, Schiller, and Hölderlin. And of course, in Russia, we have Pushkin. It was also popular in the 20th century, especially in the poetry of William Butler Yeats, Robert Frost, and of course, the indomitable T.S. Eliot. Okay, so let's read one example, right? Yeah, let's read one example. This is a very famous example by William Wordsworth, which I talked about right now. Wordsworth was the co-founder of the Romantic movement with Samuel Taylor Coleridge when they published a very, very significant work of poetry. I will not tell you the name because I will talk about it later on when I talk about another poetic form, which was popular in, of course, the Middle Ages and later on, of course, in the Romantic period. So I will talk about the book which was published and co-authored by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge when I talk about ballads later on. But let's read one form of lyrical poetry. And of course, now I want to ask you to just feel the poem, right? I'm going to read the poem for you, and then we will talk about what this particular poem discusses and why it is lyrical. So let's read it, shall we? There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore, turned wheresoever I may, by night or day. The things which I have seen I now can see no more. The rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose. The moon doth with delight look round her when the heavens are bare. Waters on a starry night are beautiful and fair. The sunshine is a glorious birth, but yet I know wherever I go that there hath passed away a glory from the earth. Do you remember when I talked about like nostalgia, especially for when we say nostalgia, we are lamenting, we are sorry that our past is not the same as the present, right? And so it has gone away. And this is what Wordsworth is saying, that the things which I have seen I can see no more, that there hath passed away a glory from the earth. Now, while the birds thus sing a joyous song, and while the young lambs bound as to the tabor's sound, to me alone there came a thought of grief. A timely utterance gave that thought relief, and I again am strong. The cataracts blow their trumpets from the steep. No more shall grief of mine the season wrong. I hear the echoes through the mountains throng. The winds come to me from the fields of sleep, and all the earth is gray. So basically what you can see here is that we have descriptions of nature and this kind of lyrical poetry. And of course the persona of the poem, which we can safely assume is Wordsworth himself, is lamenting the loss of innocence in this modern day and age. And so he's nostalgic for a glorious past which is no more. And so he compares his childhood joy, the kind of joy that you had when you were a kid, because you had a direct relationship with nature, with of course the gloominess of adulthood. And he argues that his childhood serenity is replaced by a tumultuous thought of adulthood which is plagued by grief. So that is a very good and very famous example of lyrical poetry, of course. Okay, so that's lyric. As I said, I want you to think of it as a kind of school of poetry rather than a specific poetic form. Now, let's talk about probably one of the most famous poetic forms of all, and one of the most common in English as well as other languages, including even Persian, and that is a sonnet. Now, what is a sonnet? Sonnet is one of the most popular forms of poetry in English, and it is a lyric poem. As you can see, a sonnet is a kind of lyric poem. It is written in one stanza, and it is usually associated with love and desire. So it explores the complicated human experience of romantic love. If you remember, I told you, when I was talking about all of those poets who practiced lyrical poetry in the previous slides, I talked about Petrarch and then Sir Thomas Wyatt and William Shakespeare. Those were all sonneteers. They wrote sonnets. And so English poets borrowed the sonnet from Italian. So it was not a native English genre. They borrowed it from Italian poets, in particular from Petrarch. It is a traditional form. Obviously, it has only 14 lines of iambic pentameter, and hopefully now you know what an iambic pentameter line is. And it has an intricate rhyme scheme, which we will talk about by, again, going back to the same sonnet which we discussed in our previous videos, Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. So let's talk about the rhyme scheme of sonnets. So we know that it consists of 14 lines of iambic pentameter, and then there is an intricate rhyme scheme, and we are now going to talk about the rhyme scheme by reading a sample, Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. So it is a sonnet written by Shakespeare, published in 1609, although it was written like a decade or two earlier. And it, like many of Shakespeare's sonnets, the poem talks about the nature of beauty and the capacity of poetry for the representation of the said beauty. He praises an anonymous person. Shakespeare has a sonnet cycle. Of course, we will talk about it later, but the sonnet cycle is usually a combination of so many different sonnets which are published in the form of a book, like, for example, Hafiz's Divan, or for example, Sa'di's sonnets. And so all of them are somehow related. So there's this, interconnectedness in sonnet sequences or sonnet cycles. Shakespeare's sonnet cycle talks about love, but it is a weird sonnet cycle because the object of desire, the object of love, changes like midway throughout the midway in this cycle. So in the first part of the sonnet sequence, it is argued that Shakespeare's target is actually a very young man, and so it is kind of homosexual in nature. But then it changes to a black lady, a dark lady in the second part of the sonnet sequence, which was also as scandalous as, Shakespeare talking about, the beauty of a man, even though, of course, like homosexual love was not something which was, terribly frowned upon in those ages. And so that's why Shakespeare is considered to be such a maverick or a trailblazer, so to speak, because what he did was scandalous. He was expressing his love for a young man, and then midway through his sonnet sequence, he changes course and then talks about the love for a dark lady. Now, this was scandalous because, racism, right? And so the fact that he was expressing his love for a dark lady was also as scandalous, probably, as his love affair with a young man. And so the poem uses a lot of cliches to describe the beauty of this young man, but then finally it gives up and then tries to come up with an unusual simile, which of course sort of likens the beauty of the man to the beauty of the poem itself. The rhyme scheme of a sonnet can be divided into, 3 quatrains followed by a couplet. But just keep in mind, like, that this is the Shakespearean sonnet, because the Petrarchan or the Italian sonnet has a different rhyme scheme. So this is the English or the Shakespearean sonnet, which has 3 quatrains. Now you know what a quatrain is, if of course you have already watched the previous video. And then there's a couplet at the end. So lines 1 through 12, so those 3 quatrains, follow the A-B rhyme. So it is A-B, C-D, E-F, and then there's a couplet G, right? So this is it. Let's talk about this. Like, this is the rhyme scheme of Sonnet 18. So day, May, temperate date, A, B, A, B. Shines, dim, declines, untrimmed, C, D, C, D. Fade, oest, shade, rest, E, F, E, F, C, D, G, G. So this is the English sonnet. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. This is the rhyme scheme of the English sonnet. But as I told you, there are two different types of sonnets. And the first one was initially Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. And then English people later borrowed it. So let's talk about the first one, the Italian or the Petrarchan sonnet. The Italian or the Petrarchan sonnet has two parts. So it is not three quatrains and, a couplet. We shouldn't look at it like that. We look at the first 8 lines as a unit, and then the next 6 lines as another unit. Of course, there are still, 3 quatrains and a couplet, but in the Petrarchan sonnet, there is a shift which occurs in line 9, okay? So usually the poet is talking about love and desire, the difficulty of love, or I don't know, like the beauty of the beloved, but then in line 9, a shift occurs, and then a solution is offered. And so the octave, the first 8 lines, rhyme A, B, B, A, B, B, A. And this first 8 lines present a problem to us. They tell us about the problems of the lover. But then in line 9, a shift occurs in terms of both the rhyme scheme and the subject matter. And so the rhyme scheme turns into C, D, C, C, D, C until the end. And then we no longer have the discussion of a problem, but rather a solution, which is offered to the reader. The subject of the Petrarchan sonnet is usually the hopes and the pains of a male lover. So he talks about his hopes of reuniting with his beloved and the pains of love in the first 8 lines. But then suddenly in line 9, a solution is offered, and he now feels certain that he can be reunited with the beloved. It was imitated in English by Sir Thomas Wyatt, as I said, in the early 16th century, and it was later used by 17th century poets and 18th and 19th century poets, including John Milton and Wordsworth. The other type of sonnet is, of course, the Shakespearean sonnet, which we have been talking about for quite some time now. We said that it's 3 quatrains and a couplet, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, and G, G. And then there's the subcategory of the English sonnet, which is called the Spencerian Sonnet. And the reason why we call it the Spencerian Sonnet is because it was developed by Herbert Spencer, again, one of the most famous poets in the history of English literature. And it is, again, 3 quatrains and a couplet. It is an English sonnet in nature. However, the kind of, this kind of, sonnet was used in Spencer's most famous work, The Faerie Queene. So you can find it in that work, The Faerie Queene by Spencer. But what is the difference between a Spencerian sonnet, especially in terms of the rhyme scheme, and the Shakespearean sonnet? As you can see, the quatrains have different rhyme schemes here, A, B, A, B. And then A and B completely disappear when we move to the second stanza. So we have C, D, C, D. And then C and D and A and B disappear altogether when we move to the third stanza, right? However, Spencer tried to connect all of these quatrains. So he connected them not only in terms of the subject matter and the topic, but also in terms of the rhyme scheme. So as you can see, when we say A, B, one of the rhyme schemes of the first one, especially the last one, which is repeated, moves into the second quatrain and becomes the first one of the next quatrain. And then as you can see here, the last one of the second quatrain moves over to the third one and becomes the first one in the third quatrain. So this is the Spencerian sonnet. Okay, and finally, Let's just, talk about some extra, material about sonnets. As we said, it's just a quick review. Traditionally, sonnets were used to talk about traditional romantic love. However, there were certain, changes which occurred in 16th and 17th centuries. John Donne, again, another famous English poet who was the founder of the metaphysical school of poetry, changed the topic of the sonnet from romantic love to religious issues and like religious love for the god, right? And so John Donne was one of those people who experimented with the genre of the sonnet and changed the subject matter from romantic love to religious themes. And then John Milton expanded it to other serious issues in history. As I said, when poets write a series of sonnets with interconnected themes, we call them sonnet sequences or sonnet cycles. And two very important examples are Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella and Herbert Spencer, whom we talked about a few moments ago. He also has a sonnet sequence called Amoretti. And so these are some of the best examples that we have in the history of English literature. Okay, now let's talk about another poetic form, ode. Let's talk about ode, which is, as you can see here in the first line, is another format in which lyrical poetry shows itself. So you can probably guess why I tried to include lyrical poetry or lyrics as the first poetic form or the first school of poetry here. Odes are very difficult to translate into Farsi or Persian because they can have so many different meanings. So I don't really want you to think about the Persian equivalent of it, okay? Because in Farsi, ode is sometimes translated as ghazal and sometimes as qasideh. So it is really, really different. So it is like the best suggestion I have for you is to stop thinking about it in terms of, how you can translate it into Persian. So only, try to look at it from the perspective of English literature, okay? No translations. So, ode is a long lyric poem. Now, sonnet was a fairly short one. It just had like 14 lines of iambic pentameter, and that's it. But odes are usually very long lyrical poems. The subject matter is really something serious. So, unlike traditional sonnets, which are usually about just, romantic love, odes are usually about very serious subject matter, and the treatment of that subject is also serious. So the poet here is not joking around. He is very serious in tone, and he's dealing with the serious subject matter quite seriously. Of course, the style is also elevated. It is very, serious and elevated. And there's an elaborate stanzaic structure. Okay, I'm not talking about the rhyme scheme. I'm talking about the format of the stanzas because some of the stanzaic forms and structures are repeated throughout the ode, depending on what kind of ode we are talking about. The first great practitioner of ode was Pindar. Okay, so that's why we have Pindaric Ode. So this is a person, Pindar, is the first great practitioner of odes. Now, Pindar modeled his odes on the songs that the chorus were singing in ancient Greek tragedies. So the model for Pindar was actually ancient Greek tragedies, and especially the songs that the chorus were singing. Remember tragedies, ancient tragedies, the definition by Aristotle? So in ancient Greek tragedies, we had the chorus, who were a group of singers who sang and who usually commented on the subject matter of the tragedy. Now, Pindar modeled his odes on the songs that the chorus were singing in Greek tragedy. Now, in order to do this, now let's talk about the chorus. The chorus in Greek tragedy were a group of singers who moved on the stage. Sometimes they moved to the left, sometimes they moved to the right, sometimes they stayed in the center, and they all sang. Now, this movement to the left and movement to the right and staying still in the center was actually something interesting to Pindar. And so he tried to write his odes based on this. And so in his odes, we usually have three different stanzaic structures. So the first stanza is based on one song by the chorus when they move to the left. I will tell you what they are, don't worry. Then the second stanza of Pindaric Ode is based on the second song that the chorus is singing when they move to the right of the stage. And then the third stanza is based on the song that the chorus was singing in the middle of the stage. We call them what? We call them the strophe, the antistrophe, and the epode. So strophe is the movement of the chorus to the left in which they sing a song. And usually that song is about a problem which is presented to the audiences. Then, of course, they move to the right, and we call that an antistrophe. Strophe means turn left, and then antistrophe means turn back or turn right, go back to the right of the stage. Now, this one is a complication. So this is a problem, expressing a problem in the strophe. Expressing a complication, no solutions, only a complication of the problem to make the situation worse. In the antistrophe, when they move to the right, and then when they come to the middle of the stage, and then they stand still, then they read the epode, the solution is finally offered here. And this format is repeated in Pindar's poems. The first stanza is usually a problem. The second stanza offers a complication of the problem. And then finally, in the third stanza, we have the solution. So this is the definition of the strophe. As I said, it's the first stanza of an ode, or the first movement of the chorus to the left of the stage. And it usually presents the first half of the debate or argument. And they move to the left. And then we have the antistrophe, which is the other half of the debate or further exploration of the argument in the form of an antistrophe. Antistrophe means turn back. There's no solution, okay? But then we also have an epode, which is the after song, and it is the third and the final section of the ode, the third and the final movement of the chorus. And they usually come together in the center of the stage and deliver a final stanza, and then a solution is also offered. So now let's talk about different types of odes. Now that you know the history behind it, we can now talk about different kinds of odes that we have. Obviously, the first type we're going to talk about is the regular, traditional, or Pindaric ode. And then Pindaric Ode was not written by Pindar himself. Pindaric odes were written by Englishmen in close imitation of Pindar's odes, right? So we have Pindar's odes in ancient times, and then we have the English poets imitating Pindar's odes. The strophe and the antistrophe in this one are written in one stanzaic pattern, and then the epode is written in another stanzaic pattern. And it was introduced by Ben Jonson into English literature in the 16th century. And this is an example by Ben Jonson. So you can read it. This is the turn, the first stanza. This is the counter turn, the second stanza. The rhyme scheme are the same. So if it is like A, B, 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 A, this one is also A, B, 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 A. And then the final one, the stand, or the epode, is a completely different kind of rhyme scheme. Pindar's odes it is important to note were encomiastic. What does that mean? So what is the subject matter for Pindar's odes? It is usually an encomiastic kind of poetry, which means that it is written to praise or to eulogize someone. Eulogize again means praise. So the subject matter of Pindar's odes was usually praising someone great, talking positively about someone great. That's the subject matter for Pindar's odes. However, we do have another form of ode, which is called irregular or Cowleyan ode. And the reason why we call this Cowleyan is because it was developed and introduced by Abraham Cowley into English literature. Now, Cowley also imitated Pindar, especially in the style and the subject matter. However, he completely disregarded the stanzaic pattern, the recurrent stanzaic pattern, meaning that he did not believe in, writing the astrophe and the antistrophe in one stanzaic pattern and then writing the epode in a certain other form. And just keep in mind, I forgot to tell you this. This does not mean that all odes have only 3 stanzas. No, it only means that the stanzaic pattern is repeated no matter how many stanzas we have. They are repeated in groups of 3. So imagine an ode which has 9 stanzas. How is the stanzaic form? Again, strophe, antistrophe, epode, finished. Strophe, antistrophe, epode. Strophe, antistrophe, epode. So what I forgot to tell you is that odes are not always only 3 stanzas. No, sometimes they are like 9, 12, even more. But keep in mind that the units of 3 are repeated throughout the poems, and in each unit of 3, the strophe and the antistrophe are written in one stanzaic form, and then the epode is written in another stanzaic form. Now, Abraham Cowley completely disregarded this, and he said that, well, this is stupid. Poets should be free to choose their line lengths, the number of lines that they have, and the rhyme scheme that they want to have. So what Abraham Cowley did was revolutionary, kind of liberating for a lot of English poets, because, well, it was really difficult to repeat all of those stanzaic patterns throughout your ode. So what he did was, kind of liberating in nature, because it allowed English poets to choose their line lengths freely. The number of lines in each stanza was different, and then the rhyme scheme was also completely different. The most popular form of this Cowleyan form is the poem that we just read by Wordsworth, Intimations of Immortality, the one which talked about the loss of innocence. That is like the best example of Cowleyan ode. And if you go back to it, the line length, the rhyme scheme, completely different. And of course, irregular. And that's why we call it irregular, because there is no repeating patterns. There is no repeating pattern in a Cowleyan ode. Now, it was very favored. It was much favored by all of the other romantics as well. Don't forget, this was by Wordsworth, the romantic. And it was favored by other romantics as well, because they used it to create personal odes, which of course did not have this, kind of praising other people, which was quite unique to Pindar's odes. And so these personal odes by the romantics in the romantic period included descriptions and passionate meditations of nature. And then they usually moved from outer nature to a deep contemplation in their own minds. There's a third type, which is not as popular as the first 2 ones, and it is called a Horatian Ode. It is based on the works of Horace, the Roman writer. The difference between a Horatian Ode and the Cowleyan, or even a Pindaric Ode, is that, well, this one is calm, meditative, and quite colloquial in language. And another issue is that it is written in a homostrophic structure, which means that there's only one format, does just the strophe, okay? So it's not like the Pindaric Ode, in which the strophe and the antistrophe were the same, and then the epode was different. It's not even like the Cowley's Ode, which with its freedom, with its wild freedom, sometimes they do not resemble, the stanzas do not resemble, are not alike at all in a Cowleyan ode. But then this Horatian ode is something in between, and it only has the strophe. And the structure of the strophe is repeated for the antistrophe and the epode as well. So it is one single repeated stanzaic form. The best example that our book, A Glossary of Literary Terms, offers is To Autumn by John Keats. So I have written the second and the third stanzas for you. Well, the first stanza is, the strophe, which we know what it is. But then the antistrophe, which is this one, when I copied it, it became sort of like vice versa. And the third and the final stanza, the epode, all of them have the same stanzaic structure. Just look at this. So it is A, B, B, A, B, B, C, C, D, D, E, again C, C, D, 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 and then E again. So as you can see, the antistrophe and the epode quickly and closely imitate the stanzaic form of the strophe. So the rhyme scheme is repeated. The rhyme scheme of the strophe is repeated in the antistrophe and the epode as well, and that's why we call this a homostrophic structure. So if I ask you what, in your final exam, what a homostrophic structure is, this is what it is. Okay, now let's talk about another poetic form. But before that, just give me a few seconds. I'll be back in just a second before you know it. Okay, everyone, let's continue talking about a ballad. What is a ballad? Now, I kind of gave you a sneak peek of what a ballad is when I was talking about Wordsworth and Coleridge writing a book, publishing a book, which became the Manifesto, the defining book of the Romantic movement. And it was called Lyrical Ballad, the name of the book. Well, let's talk about a ballad before we get to Wordsworth and Coleridge. The definition of a ballad is this. Now, keep in mind that we have traditional ballads, which were written by, ancient people, and then we have literary ballads, which are written by people like Wordsworth or even Coleridge, in close imitation of the traditional form. Now, a popular folk or traditional ballad is usually a song which was transmitted orally, and this song tells a story. So it tells you a story. It is very dramatic in nature. Usually the poet or the singer who sings it acts out certain parts of it, okay? So it is dramatic, and the action, it is full of action, and that's why it can also be called dramatic. It is very condensed, so there is no extra line. It is very condensed, and of course it is very impersonal, meaning that the poet refrains from including his personal feelings about the topic that he is discussing, or he does not comment on the story that he is recounting. So it is quite impersonal. And it is also important to know that because we said that it is condensed, there is no room for extra lines. There is no room for exposition, just like, for example, a short story or a novel. No. It starts with the climax of the story. So it starts in the middle. And then the story's action and its dialogues are narrated. So this song is about both the action which is going on and, of course, the dialogue between the characters. As I said, no personal feelings or opinions are expressed by the singer. And it kind of resembles folk songs which were sung by, illiterate or semi-literate people. Now, traditional ballads were usually composed by a single author, but of course, most of them are anonymous, and we don't really know who the original singer or the original poet was. Now, each singer, and this is something important to keep in mind, that because it is orally transmitted from one generation to another, each singer who memorizes the song and repeats it for the future generations usually adds something to it or changes certain parts of it. So we cannot really be certain if the version that we have is the original version and the first version and the first draft, because obviously each poet sometimes forgets certain parts of it and then adds something quite new to it. So it is important to keep all of those in mind. Now, how is it written? It is written in a kind of stanza, which has now been famously called, which is famously called the Ballot Stanza. What is it? A ballad stanza is a quatrain. So all of the ballads are written in different quatrains. The quatrain usually includes 4 or sometimes 3 stressed syllables in each line. And then the second and the fourth stanzas or lines usually rhyme. This is a mistake. You should have written. Let me just correct that out. So this is a line. So the second and the fourth lines usually rhyme. Okay. Let's read an example by a famous ballad called Sir Patrick Spens. Okay. So let me just bring my highlighting tool. Let's read one by Sir Patrick Spens and look at the second and the fourth lines, which rhyme. The king sits in Dumfarthing town, drinking the blue-red wine. Oh, where will I get a good sailor to sail this ship of mine? Just if you take a look at the spelling, these are all from like Old English. So but you can guess what the meaning is. So this is good, this is ship. So the king sits in Dumfarthing town, drinking the blue-red wine. Oh, where will I get a good sailor to sail this ship of mine? So the second and the fourth, it is a quatrain, and the second and the fourth lines usually rhyme. Now, let's talk about ballads, the characteristic features of ballads. Ballads usually employ set formulas so that the singers who memorize them can remember them well. So they have some, for example, stock descriptive phrases. Those phrases which everybody knows because they have been repeated again and again, like this blue-red wine, okay? So everywhere, whenever they talk about wine, they write it with blue-red wine. A refrain. Refrain is one line in the poem which is repeated again and again and again. And the reason for it is because, well, when you memorize this line once, you can easily remember it later, in the rest of the poem. So you can easily remember that. So refrains are repeated lines, a single repeated line in the poem, which is also another formula used by those who wrote ballads. And then another technique used by them is incremental repetition, which is like a refrain, but each time the line is repeated, we change some part of it. So it is a repetition, but incrementally or step by step, we change it and we add something to it. So imagine they say that, and the hero returned. This is a line. If this line, and the hero returned, if the line is repeated exactly the same throughout the poem, we call it a refrain. But if we have this, the hero repeated in the first stanza, and then in the second stanza we say, and the hero returned tired. And then in the third stanza we say, and the hero returned tired and weary. And in the fourth stanza we say, and the hero returned tired and weary and hungry. Each time we are adding something to it, and we call it incremental repetition, because each time we repeat the line, and the hero returned, we are adding something to it. So that's, again, another form. Now, let's talk about the history of the ballads. Many ballads were, of course, originally written in the Middle Ages, but they were not written and collected in the Middle Ages, but rather in the 18th century. We have two very famous people, two very famous books, one published in the 18th century, another one in late 19th century, and I want you to actually memorize them because they are really important. The first one was Thomas Percy, who collected a series of ballads and published them in a book called The Relics of Ancient English Poetry. And then Francis Child in 1882 published English and Scottish popular ballads. And so it was in the 18th and later on in the 19th century that ballads were for the first time collected, written down, transcribed, and of course published in the book format. We have a subcategory of ballad, which is called the broadside ballad. And the reason why we call it broadside is because this ballad was printed on one side of a single sheet, which will, of course, the one side of a single sheet is called the broadside. And so a broadside ballad is a kind of ballad which was written on only one side of a piece of paper, and it was usually distributed on the streets in the Great Britain by children who were also selling newspapers. I'm sure you've seen those movies when children are selling newspapers, shouting on the curbside, and then saying, hey, today's news, come buy the newspaper. Sometimes they were also selling these ballads. Now, the difference in subject matter is that broadside ballads were usually about current people, events, and issues. So they were contemporary in terms of the subject matter that they discussed. As I told you, most of the poets we have been talking about up to now are traditional ballads, who were usually composed by very ancient people, by old people who learned it from their moms or their dads or from other singers, and some of them were even illiterate. However, we have a literary form of it too. And a literary ballad is usually a narrative poem which is written in direct imitation of the form, language, and spirit of the traditional ballads. The best example of it is Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Now, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is one of my favorite poems. It is an extremely fascinating poem. Now, there's this mariner, a person who used to be a sailor, and then he's now drunk and very downtrodden. But then, he starts talking to to some, bystanders about his adventures on the sea, especially when he was on the sea one time, and then there was this albatross, which he killed, and then so he was plagued because of killing the albatross. And so it is a fascinating poem, which is the best example of a literary ballad. This work was actually published in a book called Lyrical Ballads. Lyrical Ballads was published in late 18th century, 1785 or so, by two very famous English poets, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And the collection of the poems that they wrote and published became the manifesto of the Romantic movement. It actually started the Romantic movement because it was in this book and later on some other books by the same authors that they described what they hated about the poetry of the 18th century, the neoclassical period, and how, because it was very formal, the language was very, elevated and pompous, and the subject matter was, ludicrous, according to them, of course. And so they wanted a more simple form of poetry, which could resemble the beauty and the simplicity of a child's perspective towards the world. And again, don't forget, we read Intimations of Immortality by Wordsworth. And one of the things that was discussed in that poem, of course, we didn't read all of it. You have to read all of it to enjoy it better. But what we discussed in that poem was that Wordsworth was discussing the difference between his childhood experiences of the world, which was unique and pure, and how adulthood changed his perspective. Actually, Wordsworth has a very famous line saying, "Child is the father of man," saying that if we adults want to be successful in life, we should actually go back to our childhood and look at the world the way a child looks at the world. And so that's basically the manifesto of the Romantic movement called Lyrical Ballad. Okay, so now let's talk about, so this is all I have to tell you about ballads. Now let's talk about an elegy. Now, elegies in English had different definitions in different periods and different, centuries. In ancient times, an elegy was any kind of poem, any poem written in elegiac meter. So in ancient times, the subject matter was not important. Nothing was important except for the meter. And the meter which was used for this kind was called elegiac meter, which included either hexameter or pentameter lines. So any kind of poem written in hexameter or pentameter lines were called an elegy. And then, of course, the subject matter was also somehow important, but not really more important than the meter. The subject matter was change and loss and the complaints of love. Okay, in 16th and 17th century, in of course England, we have John Donne's poems, the metaphysical poet, and he also wrote some love poetry, and of course he called them elegies. So elegies were first about love. However, the current usage of the meaning of elegy is usually a formal and sustained lament for the death of a particular person. So as you can see, the subject matter has changed drastically. It used to be love, now it is sorry, feeling sorry for the death of a person, being sad for the death because of the death of a person. So it's a lament for the death of a particular person. There are so many different examples. W.H. Auden's In Memory of William Butler Yeats. Now, Auden himself was a famous modernist poet who actually wrote an elegy for the death of his friend, William Butler Yeats, another famous poet. And then we have Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, which is, of course, the death, lamenting the death of people. Let's read some stanzas from Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard. I have selected, the poem is fairly long, so I have written 3 different stanzas for you. They are not, so this is not the second and this is not the third stanza. I have selected it randomly. But then this is the first stanza. The curfew tolls the knell of a parting day, the lowering herd winds slowly over the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Beneath those rugged elms, the yew tree's shade, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap, each in his narrow cell forever laid, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. For them no more the blazing hearth shall burn, or busy housewife ply her evening care. No children run to lisp their sire's return, or climb his knees the envied kiss to share. So as you can see, it's about the death of people and then moves on to lament the death of the forefathers. So there is another word which is also used for the expression of grief, especially when a person passes away. And that other word is called a dirge. So dirge is also another form of expression of grief, especially when somebody passes away. So what is the difference between them? A dirge is usually shorter, less formal, and it is usually supposed to be sung rather than read silently by the reader. So that's the difference between them. In terms of terminology, we have different other terms as well. Threnody and monody are other words which we usually associate with dirge or elegy. Threnody is called a dirge, and then monody can be used for both of them. So this is also an elegy. And then there is a subcategory of elegy, which is very, very, of course, popular, and it is called pastoral elegy. You know, whenever you read the word pastoral, because it comes from pastor, which in Latin means shepherd, you have to remember that this kind of poetry portrays some shepherds. So a pastoral elegy, in pastoral elegy, the person who is mourning, who is sad, and the person who has died are both shepherds, okay? So the people in the poem are both shepherds, both the persona and the person he laments. That's why we call it pastoral elegy. It was initially used by Theocritus and later on used by the famous Virgil, of course. And then later on, of course, it was introduced into English. Pastoral elegies had a lot of conventions, like 7 or 8 conventions, but because I didn't want this video to be too long and because it was hard to copy all of that material into the PowerPoint presentation, I actually refer you to pages 104 and 105 of the 11th edition of A Glossary of Literary Terms by Abrams, so that you can read all of those conventions and rules and formulas in length. Okay, so don't forget to read those conventions. And then finally, let's talk about epics, which in Persian we call Ash'ar Hemasi. And of course, Persian poetry has one, Shahnameh, the book of Persian kings. Epic is also called a heroic poem, and it is any kind of heroic poem that can meet the following criteria. It should be a long verse narrative on a serious subject, which has a formal and elevated style, and it is centered on a heroic or quasi-divine figure. So the figure is either somehow divine or heroic, whose actions define the fate of a tribe, nation, or even the whole human race. Especially the best example of the final one, the human race, is John Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, there are also certain rules and conventions when it comes to epic. Once again, please go to page 110 and 111 of the book, A Glossary of Literary Terms, to read all of those rules and conventions. But this is the gist of it, that it is a long verse narrative. It is very formal. It has an elevated style, and it is about a hero whose actions define the fate of a tribe. If he's successful, his tribe or his country can survive. And if he's not successful, his country will perish. There are 2 different types of epic poetry. The first one is, of course, again, literary and traditional, just like the other ones that we've had so far, like ballads. So the traditional, the folk, or the primary epics were the written version of oral poems, okay? So they were first oral and then somebody wrote them down, and they are about heroes. The best examples of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are, of course, ascribed to Homer. A lot of people are saying that Homer was not a single person. The Iliad and the Odyssey were written by, several poets, but then Homer was like the aggregator, the person who compiled the books. And of course, the famous anonymous Beowulf. I strongly recommend you read all of those. I am actually teaching my Greek and Roman mythology classes, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but then I want you to read Beowulf. And if you don't feel like reading it, there is an animated adaptation of Beowulf, which is absolutely fantastic. So if you don't feel like reading Beowulf because it is like Old English and some, words might be unfamiliar and very hard to follow, then I strongly recommend that you watch the animated adaptation of Beowulf. Please download it and watch it. It is one of the greatest of the Germanic epics which we have inherited. So these are good examples of traditional epics, which were, written forms of oral poems. But then we have literary epics as well, which is created by individual poets. And so it is not oral. It's not like, for example, several people orally sang these songs and then a poet like Homer tried to compile all of them into a single book. No. Literary epics are actually composed by a single author, and It is, of course, written in direct imitation and deliberate imitation of the traditional form. And of course, the best examples of it is Virgil's Aeneid, which, of course, tries to imitate the Iliad and the Odyssey in terms of, recounting mythological stories of mythological figures. And of course, John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is, of course, the story of the fall of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden when they were kind of coaxed and tricked by Satan. But of course, it is fascinating that the subject, the hero of that poem is Satan. And then Satan becomes this great hero, which a lot of other writers also imitated. So we have satanic heroes because Satan is portrayed as this kind of, revolutionary who revolts against the oppression of, according to, the story that John Milton is telling us. In this case, the poet portrays the Satan as a revolutionary figure who actually helped human beings and helped Adam and Eve escape the oppression of God, according to Satan. So it is a very, very fascinating book. I'm not sure if it is possible for you to read it right now, but I strongly recommend it, just like I recommended Beowulf. But unfortunately, there is no adaptation of Paradise Lost, not as much as I'm concerned. But it is a fascinating poem, nevertheless. And if you do find some time, I actually want you to read it because I absolutely love this work by, of course, John Milton. Let me just, talk about it because I like it so much. So I can tell you so many different things about it. So it has more than 10,000 lines. This is the first thing that you have to know about Paradise Lost. So it has like 10,000 lines, and it is, it's the story of the fight for the, for winning for winning heaven, and of course the ultimate fall of the human beings from the Garden of Eden. Different parts of the story are written from the perspective of the Satan, and of course from the perspective of Adam as well. So we have multiple perspectives in the same poem. And so some of the major themes that Milton is trying to describe in this poem is, of course, rebellion against oppressive forces. And then, a kind of desire to get redemption is also hidden in this. One of the reasons why John Milton tried to actually write Paradise Lost, especially he started it in 1658, is because he was mourning the death of his wife. And so basically he was in a very dark place in his life, and he wanted to actually find the meaning of life, especially a life which was, fading, because he had lost, for example, his wife, whom he loved so much. But of course, this personal aspect of the story should not really blind us to all of those religious aspects of the poem. Now, keep in mind that John Milton was actually a Puritan, okay? So all of his life, he kind of knew that, the key to survival and the key to, salvation, according to his Puritan faith, was to, to get along with people and then try to, find peace with everyone around you. And so in this story, finding peace and, getting along with people around you. And because Satan is not like that in this poem, he is called a traitor in this poem, okay? And so he is driven to hell because he has revolted against his creator, God. But then, Satan refuses to accept the rule of God. And so he plans his revenge, and he says that, well, I'm going to trick your greatest creature, human beings, and I'm going to force him to commit a sin. And so through this, John Milton portrays the first sin ever committed, but then of course the poem continues and provides a path to salvation for Adam and Eve. A lot of people, the reason why I told you that Satan became actually a favorite character in this poem, even though John Milton was a Puritan, and even though Satan is called a traitor in this poem, is because a lot of critics, including a very famous one, Christopher Ricks, believes that the God that Milton presents in this poem is actually a very harsh God who is inflexible. He does not show any flexibility. And because of this, a lot of critics argue that Milton's God is actually not just. And that's why critics like, for example, Christopher Ricks argue that, Milton inadvertently, without really wanting to, has given Satan a charismatic figure because he's portrayed as a revolutionary who has revolted against this oppressive God. And Satan is also portrayed as a person with a lot of will, strong will. And that's why a lot of people actually like Satan in this story. And so they love him, and they even quote him because, again, John Milton, a Puritan, has written some of his best lines, has saved some of his best lines for Satan. And so it is fascinating. I can't really help laughing here that some of the words which Milton has used for the character of Satan are actually the words which are associated with democracy in other world. Like, for example, free will. Like, for example, being accepted by the people, accepting the rule of the people. Or, for example, to be a free man, to not be, oppressed, to try to find your calling in life. And then, of course, all of these, and of course, the issue of legitimacy. He says that, Satan says that legitimacy is actually given to you by people. And so you have to respect what people want to do. So he tells God that you have to respect what Adam and Eve want to do. If they want to eat the apple of the knowledge tree, of the tree of knowledge, just, let him do that. And that's actually what this poem is all about. Sorry for talking about this, even though it was not part of the original plan, but I couldn't really help talking about this because it is one of my favorite poems. And so this is an example of a literary epic. Anyway, thank you guys for watching the video. This is not all of the poetic forms which we're going to discuss, no, but I think this one is enough because the video is already like 90 minutes long. So we will talk about the other poetic forms in another video, which I will upload for you as well. So there are some other forms, like, for example, blank verse, free verse, palinodes, light verse. All of these have to be included in our discussions because they're also significant for us. But I will record those in a second video. Anyway, thank you very much for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good day, and bye-bye.